Hi, welcome back to class. And this week we are moving on to the family. So this is a section that is actually another section people get really into in sociology. And so there's a lot of change that takes place over time with the family, and it's something that people are curious about and they discuss quite a bit. And they wonder about how those changes will affect the future of society. And so it's an area, like I said, that has a lot of interest. And so we're going to get into that this week, and we're also going to step into looking at intersectionality. And so one assignment that we had due was to look at some areas where you may have felt oppressed in your life. And intersectionality basically gets the idea of maybe a few of those things can intersect. And so, let's say if people think, well, my race may be an area that I may come across some oppression, but so is my gender, and so is my age. Any one of those things can happen. They could also cross over, and you have numerous things happen. But intersectionality basically looks at the fact that more than one factor could determine how one person may be discriminated against or treated differently. And so it's a very interesting concept, and it's actually a newer piece of study. So once you hear about it, you usually think, well, that makes a lot of sense. I'm surprised that people didn't know about this for a long time, but really, this just started being discussed in the late 80s and early 90s, so not too long ago. But we're going to get into that a little bit, and I will work through that here with you and show you how we're going to do that. Part of it is you're going to see a criminologist discuss intersectionality theory, and she's actually one of the pioneers of the theory herself. And so you get to hear it right from the person who had a big opportunity to make their mark and put together some theory. So as we go through this chapter, you're going to look at the family, and like I said, this is an area that people like to talk about a lot. This is on people's minds, is marriage and family, and it's something that's commonly discussed. It's also something that we're going to watch a TED Talk video on, and on that video you're going to see that there are applications. So George Carey will do the TED Talk, and in that TED Talk he'll talk about the idea of understanding the dynamic of family, how it changed, how it's changing over the years. Institutions, they do evolve, and so it's nice to have a good understanding of where they're going and be able to use that to properly market goods and ideas, deal with ideas like quitting smoking. That's something that he talks about in there a little bit, and I've actually seen an interesting article about 20 years ago. There was an article written about there was a man who couldn't quit smoking, and it was in a Reader's Digest. And in the article, his daughter or granddaughter got a hold of him and asked him why smoking was more important to him than spending time with her. And he wrote her a letter explaining that she was more important, and due to that letter he ended up quitting smoking. And so the idea of looking at family in a different way has been utilized by people who wanted to get people to quit smoking. It's also been exploited by politicians and other people throughout years, and in trying to get people to get on board with their ideas. So there is there are people who do try to use these studies to actually see where they can go, how they can gain from it, or how they can move society or sell a product. So it's interesting to look at. We're going to watch that TED Talk, and you'll have a discussion on that. And again, we have a quiz. So just moving through, I'll explain what we have here. Intersectionality, you're going to watch a short video describing intersectionality. It's important you watch this because people get this wrong all the time. And one area that they'll come across is, how do you know if you are discriminated because, let's say there's an African American woman who is discriminated against. So how would she say that she was discriminated against for being African American and for being a woman? What the idea of intersectionality looks at is it could have been either of those. It could have been both. So it could have been one or another. It could have even been a different factor. But the idea is your area of disadvantage or advantage could intersect. And so it could be more complicated than simply just boiling it down to one thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch this video, and then we're going to watch Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a criminologist, and she helped coin this term. She's also a professor of law at UCLA and Columbia University. Those are on either coast, so she travels. She's very famous, and she, like I said, came up with this idea, and actually came up with a case. I don't think she discusses it in this video, but in the case, she was dealing with a factory, so a place of employment, and what happened was they weren't hiring African American women to work there, and she was trying to establish how they're being discriminated against. The problem that she came across was they did hire a lot of African Americans to work for the company, but they were all men, and they were working in labor. So they did have men being hired. They did have women being hired, so they had women being hired in their offices, and they were all white. So what she came up with was, okay, the company wasn't discriminating on race. They weren't discriminating on gender, but they were discriminating on the fact that they weren't hiring women who were of color. And what happened was she had to try to prove this, which is very difficult to prove in law, that there was discrimination taking place at this intersection. So in this particular case, when she came up with this term, it was to deal with a particular intersection that was taking place. And she was right. The company wasn't hiring African American women. They were hiring men, and they were hiring African Americans. They were hiring men that were African American, and they were hiring women that were white, but they weren't hiring African American women. They also did have white men working on their floor and throughout the company, and white women working throughout the company. So that will be discussed, but it's good to have a little bit of background on this, but I want you to understand this idea. It's a more complicated idea, but I think it's one that you should tap into in looking at sociology, because when we get to the section on education, we're going to watch another video with Patricia Hill Collins, who again is another sociologist who studies intersectionality. So she totally pivots with this, and she goes further with it, and she actually brings it into the educational world. So we're going to keep going with this, and I hope you're getting it. It's, like I said, a more complicated idea than we normally discuss in an intro class, but it's wonderful to discuss. Here's the video we're going to watch, the TED Talk, looking at the future of families. And then you're going to have your discussion forum using that TED Talk. So you're going to discuss a change in the family, one that you find interesting. He's going to talk about a few things that change. And then we're going to discuss one of the implications of this change. So how can someone utilize understanding of change in the structure and direction of the modern family? It's looking at how, again, people outside can use this. He's not a sociologist, he's a businessman, but I would argue that he's very aware of social science, and so he's using it to discuss this information. We have the quiz, and again, links to know more. So this should be an interesting week, and I think I think a lot of you will find a lot of interest in this section, especially the intersectionality. The family is one area that people like to look at because people usually have very strong feelings on their family. So the one they're raised in, or the one they're currently in right now, or the family that they're in charge of, so we, as our life course changes, our relationships change in our family. And again, it's something that people like to talk about, or there might be something they don't want to talk about there, but it's still important to understand. So I leave you with that, and if you have any questions, make sure you get back to me. Again, I want to bring up the idea on the discussion forums to make sure you put a well thought out response. Show me and the class that you've actually read and understand the material, or that you've watched the videos. These questions aren't very hard to answer. They're designed to make you think, and I want you to do that. So it's very important that you take the time, you reflect, and you write a well thought out answer for these. It'll make the discussion better, and it'll make your grades better in the Dropbox. So again, if you have any questions, make sure you send me an email. I'll love to discuss things with you. If you have any complicated questions, send me a phone number and a time to call you, and we'll have a conference over the phone. All right, well, thank you so much, and have a great week.